And I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's presentation, Laden with Mercies and Sorrows, the Civil War Diary of Elizabeth Wright Moffat. My name is Matt. I'm the head librarian and local history librarian at the Moffat Library of Washingtonville. And it is my honor and privilege to introduce you to Professor Marguerite Maria Rivas. She is a professor of English literature at the Manhattan Borough Community College. And her and I actually go a ways back. We met at a history conference. I'm thinking maybe 2014, 2015.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. So, and she's presented on Mrs. Moffat's diary, and I had just started working at the Moffat Library, and we started talking afterwards. And little did we know that that interaction would lead us to this moment where Marguerite would be sharing with us her voice and her stories. So this presentation, before we begin, is along with the rest of our local history lectures for this year, are dedicated to the memory of Linda Standish, who is our late village historian. She passed away in January of this year and was an advocate of trying to kind of bring to light people and events that shaped our village and really kind of pushed provocative questions and allowed us to kind of look beyond kind of the great and the good at the usual ordinary people, or people that we just don't really hear about too often. So this presentation is fitting for that. But without further ado, I'm going to mute myself. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll read them at the end of the presentation, or depending on how Marguerite feels, she could answer them too. But I'll leave that to her. But with that, thank you, Marguerite, and I'll let you have the floor now.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Had I not been exposed to COVID by 3 classes of students, I had students in each class, one of whom sat in front of me and sneezed quite a few times before class was over, I would be with you in person. I was really looking forward to it. It's interesting, Matt's story is funny because he came up to me and said, "Do you know there's a Moffat library?" And I was floored. I mean, I had just started to scratch the surface. And you want to hear something extremely ironic? I think it's so ironic. So I'm a storyteller. Matt did mention it. I don't know if he knows it. So I'm a storyteller also with a storytelling organization called The Moth. You may have heard of it. Anyway, I'm not going to ramble, but I want to tell you a story. My daughter Ariel got married 5 years ago, and we live on Staten Island. And I had never heard of Washingtonville until I started to do this research and met Matt. She went to look for a house, to buy a house, and she couldn't buy one in this area. So she said, "I'm going to go look upstate." And she came back and she said, "Mommy, I found such a beautiful house. It's in Washingtonville, New York. Have you ever heard of it?" I said, "I have, my darling." So she lives around the corner from the library now. So it's just like such a coincidence, who would think? So anyway, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the diary and what. Okay, so let me just share my screen. Is it sharing? No, let me see. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Just give me 1 minute if you don't mind. Get this up. And get back here. And share the screen. And okay. So I think I'm getting some feedback. I'm not sure. Okay. So first, can everyone hear me? You just nod your head or put the little thumbs up. Okay. So The title of my little presentation tonight is The Civil War Journal or Diary of Elizabeth Wright Moffat. And before I continue, I just want to thank the Staten Island Museum collection. And Cara Delate was the archivist at the time that I discovered the diary. And she's now at the Research Center at NYPL. And Gabriella Leone is from the Staten Island Museum. And I'll talk a little bit more about the diary now in a minute. But before I do that, I want to just introduce you to some of the main people that I may be mentioning in the diary. So Samuel Moffat, as some of you may know, is the son of, is the brother of David H. Moffat, who endowed your beautiful library. But I just wanted to show you, this is Samuel Moffat is, it's the older brother. So these are his birth and death dates. He died in Goshen, yeah. So his wife is Elizabeth Wright, and his sons mentioned in the diary called Wrighty, his Thomas Wright Moffat. You see the dates there, 1852, 1902, and Edmund Judson Moffat, called Eddie in the diary, 1857 to 1899. So these two young men are mentioned throughout the diary. Mrs. Moffat was a woman who cared for her family, cared for her community, was civically engaged with her community, and did great service to the people of Albany area where she lived, and as well as the country during the Civil War on the Northern home front, which is something we don't often hear of. We hear of the Southern home front. There's a famous diary by a woman named Mary Chestnut. If you see Ken Burns's documentary, you'll hear excerpts from that. But the Northern home front isn't something that we talk too much about. And so Maria, or Minnie, she was born during the Civil War, and Martha was born after. And Martha will become important in our little story here. So I went on sabbatical in 2013, 14. And my goal, so one of the things I do is literary research, is I go try to recover women's voices lost to history. So, you know, when you were, when I was an undergraduate in the 70s, late 70s, I would have a Norton Anthology of American Literature. And I think perhaps Emily Dickinson might have been one of the few women in it. And I remember asking a high school teacher once, how come we don't study any women writers? And this is high school honors. And he said, because there aren't any. So that was kind of the message I got. And I, of course, you know, tried not to believe that. But anyway, so I went to New Mexico. I said, where would I find women's writing that's not been published, that might have lyricism to it? I said to myself, letters back home. So I thought, who would write them? And Army wives. So I went to New Mexico, Fort Union, which had the New Mexico Highlands University nearby had huge archive of Fort Union papers. And I started looking through and trying to find writing by women. And I actually found writing, a little bit of writing. And then I looked in other places, and I came home, New York Public Library, and I didn't find what I was looking for. Right toward the end, sabbatical, I went to my own little Staten Island museum, which I had been to many, many times before. And I was in the room. There was a room, and there were Xerox machines and old-fashioned microfilm machines running. And Kara, who was the main archivist, was answering phone calls, and Gabriella was helping people, and there were graduate students, and it was sort of like the end of the semester for them. So it was really, really, really busy. And I had exhausted everything, and Kara was walking past me with a package in her hand, and I said to her, "And are you sure there aren't any more diaries that I haven't seen?" And she said, "Well, we have a diary that we got a grant for someone just to read the diary this summer. So we chose someone from Stuyvesant High School, which is like the elite high school in New York City. And this person read the diary." And I said, "What did the person say?" And she said, the person said that it was a woman who baked pies and cakes and went to church a lot. That's exactly what she said to me. And I said, "Okay." I said, "May I see it?" She said, "Sure." And I could see she was so harried, so harried. And so so this shows, so we have, this is what I was literally working from, the old-fashioned card catalog. I went through every single thing that could possibly have a diary, even family papers. So often in what I've found, women's writing are sometimes accessioned, brought in as family papers and not necessarily enumerated as their own writing. So this is the box that the diary actually came from, and they are the Brownell family papers. And that's the package that Kara was carrying as she walked past me. And, you know, she was bringing it back like Indiana Jones style at the end of like Raiders of the Lost Ark, bringing it back to the archives to be put back in that box. So she gave it to me and set me up. And I looked at the dates. And if you look, you'll see the dates say 1861 to 1866. And said I to myself, there is no way that there isn't anything but cakes and pies in church during those years, because those are the years of the Civil War. And this is what it looked like. When I got it, it had masking tape on it. And it was retrieved from this folder. And the cards usually say where it came from. And that is another story. So let's see. So this is what the front cover of the journal looks like. It's all written in pencil. And there's a dedication there. And it's inscribed, "Mrs. Samuel Moffat from her good husband, January 1st, 1861. And so this is a New Year's gift from Samuel Moffat to his wife. And there are their children, the two children I spoke about. And as soon as I read this, I noticed two things in terms of it as a piece of writing. There were these lyrical passages juxtaposed with absolutely ordinary everyday life things. So this is her opening of 1861. You know, may the unwritten pages of the future be more free from imperfections than the past has been, that when the book of judgment is opened at the last day, our record may be clean. So the Denver Library was also a source for some of the photographs having to do with very scant photographs of this Moffat family, but many of David's. So interestingly, you know, Mrs. Moffat talks about, here's the actual page. She talks about her feelings, hopes, and fears for the future alternately arise. And, you know, there's this feeling, January 1861, we know there are troubles already. And then she thinks, but then she'll again have these ideas and say, well, things will come out, things will work out for the best. So when I saw it was 1861, I said, okay, well, let's look at April 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter. I can't imagine someone wouldn't make note of that. And on my way to 1861, on the top right-hand side of the page, I saw the president-elect today. And this is what I read. Went to the Capitol to hear and see the president-elect. Large crowd to hear small speech. Mr. Lincoln looked very much like any man, and no doubt will continue so to the end of his presidency. And that's an actual engraving of that speech. So I was in shock, I thought, she saw Lincoln. I mean, is she Forrest Gump of the 19th century? She saw Lincoln. So I shouted out to Kara, did the person think that there was television in 1861? She said, what do you mean? I'm yelling and I'm pointing. I said, she saw Lincoln in person. She saw Lincoln, and everything stopped. It was one of those things that you see on television, you never really believe that would happen. A record scratch. The Xerox machine stopped. The film stopped. Everything stopped. And I looked at her, her face was just like draining of color. She said, what? She saw Lincoln? And then you could hear it echo through. People like, there's a Lincoln? I said, yes. She was an eyewitness to Lincoln. And then she turned around and she looked at me and she said, oh my God, somebody has to read the diary. And they all looked at me. And I was about to return to work from sabbatical. I still had summer off. And when you'll see the diary, it's written in pencil. It's very hard to see. So this is actually a picture. I can make that. I actually, the actual diary doesn't have that dark a writing to it. I upped the contrast so you could see it, but you can see where she wrote Monday, the 18th of February. So she's from Albany, went to the Capitol to hear and see the president-elect. Large crowd to see a small speech. And then there's that quote. So she sees Lincoln and then she says, evening. And then she went to a lecture afterwards. And who does she see at that lecture but Mr. Beecher, the abolitionist? So I was just like in heaven here. So what she's talking about is she's going to Tweddle Hall. So what she's talking about is something called the Lyceum Movement, which started around 1840, where people would, there would be lecturers and people would go on the circuit it was sort of an adult education, if you will. And people would go on the road, and among them, Beecher would give a lecture or give a talk. And if you look at, this is what I mean when I say that, just the everyday is juxtaposed. The children went with mother to Mrs. Hallenbeck's to see the sights. So we start with Lincoln and then we end with her children and going with her mother. And this is the beauty of this writing in this diary. And if you look at the next day, Eddie, that's the son, and I have spent today at mother's. And then she'll talk more about domestic things. Okay, let me get back here. So we'll note the date is February 18th, 1861. Now, here's an interesting thing that I found out in the course of my research. Here we have a picture of Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and in the right-hand corner, you might recognize that guy. That is John Wilkes Booth. So on February 18th, 1861, when Lincoln was in Albany, so was John Wilkes Booth. Who knew? So if you look, this is a sort of to the right is the playbill. And then I transcribed it. I found this in the Albany Times Union. And it's interesting. February 18th, returned to the stage, performed as Duke Pescara in The Apostate. Reports are that even though his right shoulder was taped, he performed several on-stage fencing maneuvers with his left hand, meaning John Wilkes Booth. And we see here that at the same time, Lincoln was there, Booth was there in the same city. And just all around that time, Jefferson Davis, I don't know if it was on that date, the 18th, was elected as the president of the Confederate States of America. And he was inaugurated on the 22nd. So here we have this sort of collision of these things. And Mrs. Moffat is right in the middle of them. So one of the things, as I mentioned, Mrs. Moffat was a person who's civically engaged. And she once war did come, she and other women cut shirts out for the soldiers. And here we have again another one of those juxtapositions where she's cutting out shirts in the afternoon, and then evening Samuel read aloud while Mother and I made lints for the war. Lints would be like bandages. And then again, the past week has been one of suspended excitement. Next week is expected to tell a fearful story. These are sad days to live in, yet very few think of or realize their meaning. May God give wisdom and faith to his children. And then fingers sore, I can hardly hold the pencil. So this is just amazing. It's just, she's writing about these things in this 1 week. And she's wise enough to understand that people don't realize what's coming. And her finger is so sore from cutting things out for the war effort. So we talked about that Lyceum movement, and it's so funny because when I would go through the thing, I'd see Mr. R.W. Emerson, and so the museum archivist set me up in a separate room with the diary, and I just couldn't help but yell out. I'd yell out, "She saw Emerson in person." And of course, it was in person, became the joke. But here she has. So they go out to these lectures. Samuel and I have been to see Anderson the musician, very fine performance of the kind. And we have been to a lecture by Ralph W. Emerson, independent course. That's from the diary, her telling about seeing Emerson. And this diary at this point, early in the war, is just she's witnessing events and she's sewing. And, she talks, here's the firing on Fort Sumter. Rain all day and continued excitement from Charleston. Our vessels of aid cannot reach Fort Sumter in consequences of a storm, beside the bomb shells which have been flying thick and fast all day. And then the domestic. Mother has been very sick indeed with severe head and bone ache. Samuel gone to rehearsal, finished Righty's shirt, that's her other son. And look at this. This is the report that Fort Sumter is taken. So my supposition is that she's writing this at perhaps 3 times a day. What we start with, juxtapose is finishing her son's shirt, her husband going to rehearsal. I'm not sure she's rehearsing. And that Fort Sumter is taken. It's just chilling. Then she talks about the war starting. And, things like Mother is going to see about a bathing apparatus. So, this is like a newfangled indoor thing. And then report of the South firing the first shot on Fort Sumter. Everybody is excited for the war has begun. So here is someone, Samuel Moffat's wife, David Moffat's sister-in-law. This is how she'd be known throughout history, as this footnote. And in fact, she is a witness to history and she writes about it. in lyrical fashion, and then gives us what the everyday home front, Northern home front is like for her. It's just amazing. She talks about the soldiers departing, and just even the way that she talks about them, such a day has never been seen here before. The streets have been one mass of people. The soldiers left this afternoon, taking with them and leaving many a sad heart behind. I never saw so many horrible faces before reaching the boat, here inserted, which conveyed them to the cars. Prayers were offered by Dr. Pitkin and a beautiful banner presented by Mayor Thatcher on behalf of his wife. So we get this sense of, okay, war's begun, it's real. Oh, I had read that already. Okay. So at one point, Mrs. Moffat and Samuel Moffat have a visitor from New York City. Her name is Hattie Beeman, and she's ironically from Staten Island. And they go to escort her to the boat, like that would go down the Hudson. They would take the boat to New York City. And they escort her there, and according to the diary, there's some sort of weather event, and they can't get off the boat, and it leaves with them in it. So the weather event, I think, so it leaves with them in it, and they didn't get off the boat in time. They had to stay in New York for a day. Now, having had small children myself, I would imagine there was a big wink and a nod on the boat left with this in it. But so here's another irony. Hattie Beeman, the house that I lived in for many years, the house that my sister owned for decades, was on a place called Beeman Avenue. No doubt Hattie Beeman had something to do with that. Okay. So they went from Albany to New York City, and it was so interesting. Let me see, hold on, I'm gonna get back here. Yeah, so what was interesting, this is kind of what you think about sometimes when you think about the Civil War. You see encampments in places you wouldn't imagine. And she said, we strayed about the city, saw the tents and soldiers at City Hall Park. And you could see that the encampments were beginning. And then she talks about Central Park, which was just, all these things were like brand new. Went to the Museum of Central Park, which is indeed beautiful. And the rain prevented them from going around. But here we have a view of Central Park in 1861. Not seeing any city behind it. And then the soldiers returned. She talks about the returning soldiers coming back only about a year later. Numbering over 300 arrived this morning and were conveyed to the hospital in wagons provided for the purpose. The streets were thronged with people to see the melancholy spectacle. Today, one has been one of excitement, and our sympathies are with the suffering soldiers. 3 have died today. Oh, may God have mercy upon us all and enable us to do our duty. So here we have again the glimpse of the woman behind the closed doors, doing the work of war effort work. Here she talks about hosting a volunteer. And she said, Mother and I have been ironing all day. They were ironing havelocks, these headpieces for the soldiers. Had a volunteer to dinner. And then evening, Samuel came home from the YMA meeting with Samuel. My finger has been so sore, very sore today. I cannot yet tell what it will amount to. So here we have Samuel off going to a lecture. And then 1863, July 1863. I know I'm skipping quite ahead, but I wanted to bring pieces that might be ring bells from history class. Were the draft riots in New York City. So one of the things about the draft riots is that people could hire a substitute to go to war for them. So if you had enough money, you could do that. And it turns out that Samuel Moffat was one of those people who did hire a substitute. In this, I think she also talks about Hattie Beeman coming. People were fleeing New York. So again, her labor for the union, if you can see this Harper's Weekly, pretty much depicts the kinds of things they would go together at at a hall or at a church, and they would spend the day selling bandages, heavy linen. My fingers are rather tired. It'd be hard work to cut through 2 thickness of heavy linen. It has been a very warm day. So can you imagine wearing all that on a very warm day? And what I know from Mrs. Moffat is that she's given to understatement. Okay, then I'm going to skip. So I'm back again to the beginning of the war. And this is the volunteers at the Albany Arsenal. And Oni, I'm not sure who Oni is. Maybe someone there can tell me, don't know. The volunteers are not in uniform. So we saw a hard looking set. I think the men were gruff, and there were about 1,000 there, and I have to say 100 expected tonight. I have bathed Righty and Eddie, and they are all right. Ed enjoys the warm weather so much. If it were not for the general gloom, this springtime would be enjoyed by all. As it is, everyone feels the weight of evil forebodings. So this is a month after the firing on Fort Sumter. And again, she's giving us an eyewitness account of what this was like. You can read in history books about it, but to read someone writing what they see. And then again, her children, and leaving with that sense of foreboding. So I'm just going to quickly mention that in Albany, she worked with General Rathbone, who was the cousin of Henry Rathbone, who you might have recognized, who was with the Lincolns. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, were in the booth with them. They were invited last minute and they went, and this is his cousin. Clara Harris was known to Mrs. Moffat, is mentioned in the diary, was known to Mrs. Moffat. And so, again, even after the war, she established, worked very hard to establish educational institutions and also an orphan asylum in Albany. And this is just an example of, this is just an example of just 2 pages, what we see historically. She's talking, they hear the music from Donnelly's regiment leaving. And then she talks that Samuel is at the arsenal. You can see here we have, oh, it's Hattie Beeman again. Sewing, wrote to Hattie Beeman, Samuel at the arsenal. Oh, Mary Moffat's here. And oh, this is what I'm going to show you. So she talks about Father and Mother Moffat arrived at 8:30 o'clock this morning. So often, so throughout the diary, you'll see the Moffats from Orange County coming up to visit. Hunter is mentioned, Brother Hunter, she calls him, and Henry are mentioned among others. And so here we have in these 2 days, let's just take a look at that. So she talks about the regiment coming and bringing her son to see the soldiers. Take a look at that slide for a minute. I mean to be reading at you, but here we go. Okay. and they were leaving. So there were Union victories, and those she celebrated in her diary and she talked about. She followed the war news very closely. She didn't just bake cakes and pies and go to church. And these victories were celebrated. And, if you look at, 1862, and the war still had years to go, but they're celebrating Washington's birthday here. Bells have rung merrily, processions moving and flags flying in every direction, fireworks, and an eventful week. Everything's happy, except, her. And then again, the juxtaposition of the public and the private. Her grandmother dies. Her grandmother lived with her mother and grandmother. And then also President Lincoln's son had died at the same time. And her observation, this joy and sadness goes hand in hand. There are just so many wise things she says. And then again, here we go. The old and young leaving us, sorrow all about. But everything looks so gay with flags floating in the breeze. The news that Manassas is ours has spread happiness, but sorrow too throughout the land. And this idea that this woman is on this northern home front, observing or getting the news and seeing around her the toll of that war. So skipping ahead to a bazaar, and I didn't know about something called the Sanitary Fairs. These were fairs that were held throughout the United States to raise money for the war effort. So you can if you want to take a minute to look at this slide, you can see a little bit about the Sanitary Fairs. So these were almost what we would think of as, World's Fairs. And one of the things, and so that's the amount of money they mentioned. And here's a flyer for the fair. And Clara Harris is mentioned as one of the people who is behind the efforts for this fair. And Clara Harris, look at her again. So one of the things they did was they had booths from different countries, and Mrs. Moffat writes about sewing for the English booth and for the Scottish booth. And I was able to, thanks to the archives in Albany, ascertain that this man here standing, that's Samuel Moffat. And so they had these tableaux, so they, would represent, so to speak. And she talks about him being in the English booth, and I was able to get the librarian, the state librarian helped me out quite a bit. And so Mrs. Moffat doesn't appear in any of these pictures, but she's sewing for them. So if you look at the 1864, that's the year her daughter was born. So imagine she's either pregnant or she's about to give birth. And she talks more about the English booth. And you can see that luckily I was able to, there were notations on these. So that's how I knew that was Samuel Moffat. Finished 2 pin cushions and made a Scotchman and a child's apron. I took to the English booth. So I'm like staring around over here trying to figure out if I can see the thing that Mrs. Moffat sewed. And again, the lecture circuit, George William Curtis was a famous abolitionist, and he was the editor of Harper's Weekly. They went to the Dudley Observatory, which was sort of the first of its kind. And I don't think I have it here, but they, oh yeah, I showed you this already. Things like demonstration of laughing gas, a brand new thing. They went to see that performance. And again, Miss Payne and Miss Paddock went with Samuel and I to hear Henry W. Beecher. So she sees, here's Henry Ward Beecher speak. This is out of order. Let me get back here. So we have now, we're at 1865. She's witnessing the funeral of the president. She can hear, she writes in the diary about hearing the bells toll for the president while having her baby. So it was largely, I did not see the remains, but the crowd was infinite. Took the baby up to Maria's, where we spent the day to see the procession as it passed their house. So Maria was her sister. So she could see not only that, there's another part in which she later mentions after the war, seeing Ulysses S. Grant walk by the house. And here she talks about preparations for the funeral. These are actual photographs of that time. So let me get to David and Fanny. So I've done a number of these presentations. I told Matt that I hoped it wasn't going to be a Frankenstein, because I try to bring them to different audiences. I got this photograph from, I'm not sure. I could not find the notation on it. I do believe it may have been the New York State Library, and the notation was David Moffat and Fanny Buckhout. So what I did was I was able to find, so it was so interesting because I was able to find this description of David and Fanny's marriage, because if you look on family trees and things like that, ancestry is a good tool for historical research, but you have to, double check everything you're reading with a source that's reputable, because people will sort of just take family trees and just share them with information that's not correct. I could never find the exact date of David and Fanny's marriage, but here I found it in Mrs. Moffat's diary in December 11th. And she wrote in the margin, Wednesday 11th, David and Fanny married. She said, I reached Mechanicville this morning in time for breakfast, done whatever my hands found to do. And that is Mrs. Moffat. Helped pack Fanny's trunk and etc. So I'm wondering, are they going west? The gentlemen who came in carriages from Albany did not arrive until 2 o'clock, owing to the state of the roads, it having rained quite heavily early this morning. We immediately proceeded to St. Luke's Church. That's where they got married. Oh, where they got married, yes. And let me see if I have my notes here. She also talks about, in the diary, she talks about Fanny being married in her traveling suit. Now, I can't tell you anything about the provenance of this photograph. I studied it really carefully to make sure that this was indeed David and Fanny. And if you look at portraits of them in their younger years, you'll see they match up. So I have David, I have Fanny, I have Samuel, and I have Eddie and Righty, and I don't know where Mrs. Moffat is. The Denver Library, Public Library, had Eddie and Righty, and they had a photograph of unknown Moffat woman. that seemed to have been accessioned, brought in at the same time as Eddie and Righty. And I only saw, they only would give me a little thumbnail of it. And I don't know that that's Elizabeth Wright Moffat, so she's not included in that picture here, but. And so now we get to the end. So this diary covered the entirety of the war. And as you can see, paper being dear, from the beginning, we had that long, the long lines, and here she's just trying to get every single bit into that diary. You can hardly see a thing. And I had it originally included more about Lincoln and Clara Harris and her and Rathbone. You can look up Clara Harris and you can find a lot of weird and interesting and very sad information. But I wanted to end with some happy stuff as we're going toward Thanksgiving, where Father and Mother Moffat come. Here we have Monday, the 21st, November, having just finished packing, expecting to start tomorrow for Newburgh, and fearful of our dear baby taking cold, but hope she will not. Righty and I will take her in the boat to avoid exposure. Samuel, Mother, and Eddie will take the Wednesday train, Providence permitting, so we can all spend Thanksgiving with Father and Mother Moffat. So they're going down to Newburgh. And on Tuesday, left home this morning at 8 o'clock and arrived safe in Newburgh at 8 p.m. Father Moffat met us, and after a hearty welcome from Mother Moffat, Charles, and Cecilia, a good supper, we retired. And that's what we got.
And thank you everybody for attending tonight's presentation. I'm gonna, if Marguerite, if it's okay with you, I'm going to open the floor to questions. If people want to ask anything, I'm just going to ask, if you want to ask a question, you could just unmute yourselves. Perfectly fine. So. I know that Ruth asked earlier when you were talking about I guess when Mrs. Moffat observed a president-elect at the Capitol, you were referring to the Capitol in Albany, or
the Capitol. She meant the Capitol. I imagine she meant the Capitol building, because Albany is the capital in New York. I think that was. She spelled it the same way that we would spell the Capitol, with the O, but yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Anybody else? Yeah, thank you, Angela. We really appreciate you saying that. It was a treasure to hear. I will.
Oh, thank you.
Marguerite is also. I don't know. Marguerite's also mentioned that she worked on helping to get funding to get that diary digitized. Yeah,
I forgot to mention that.
If
so
you
the
want to talk about
diary,
that.
yeah. So the diary, as you'd seen it sort of in pieces like that, I helped the museum. I helped write a grant for them to get $50,000 to restore that diary and two other small pieces of writing. I think one was a diary of a Hessian soldier, a small one. And every bit of it was spent in restoration of the diary. And they also scanned the diary. And it is up on the Internet Archive.
And we're going to include a link to that when we post this video to YouTube. We'll send an email newsletter out, and we'll include a link to that. And we're also going to put a link to that on our local history page too, so it'll be up there in perpetuity. As long as it's being hosted by Internet Archive, you could view it online as well. I see here Ruth asked, did Elizabeth ever visit Washingtonville, or was it just Newburgh?
I don't know. She talked about Orange County, visiting Orange County, Newburgh. She talked about Hunter arriving from Washingtonville. My best guess is that that diary only covered those years of the Civil War. Oh, how it was found. I wanted to tell you that really quickly. That it only covered the years of the Civil War. That was the only diary they had in the accession of those papers. So very likely, very, very likely she's been to Washingtonville. Absolutely. So those papers, it says Brownell family papers, and it's a gift of Hugh Powell. And Hugh Powell was the very first archivist that when volunteer archivist, and he was a historian, and he knew every single bit of history on Staten Island. And toward the end of his life, this amazing trove of encyclopedic history, he got Alzheimer's. And Kara, who I mentioned, was such a wonderful person. So the person who was taking care of Mr. Powell would get him dressed up in his suit and bring him to the archive, and Kara would give him a task to do. And so he knew where he was, and he knew he was doing his work, even if it was just copying something out. But when Kara and I tried to figure out where it came from, she held up one of those cards, and she finally, because there were two different sets of cards, and one are accession cards. And she looked at the accession card, and she looked at me, and she mouthed, "Gift of Hugh Powell," which meant we had no idea how that came to the hands of the library. Because what Hugh Powell often did was he would go to estate sales and yard sales, and he would just buy up the paper. And then he would bring it into the museum and just, because he worked there. So we'll never know, except I was able to, doing some genealogical work, find that Mrs. Moffat's youngest daughter, Martha, married a man named Brownell. And I find them on Staten Island. So I suspect that, and she had a daughter. So I suspect that somehow when Mrs. Moffat died, long before Samuel and David, she knew enough to keep that Civil War diary. And someone sold it in a yard sale.
Matt?
Yes.
Matt, can you hear me? Jim
Yes.
Casassa here. Sharon's doing some looking in some of the genealogy she's researched, but there was a David Wright who actually lived in the house that my wife's family now owns in Washingtonville, and he had acquired that property from the Moffat family. And we're going to look and see if it's perhaps his daughter, who's the Mrs. Wright Moffat, that wrote this diary. And if I find anything concrete on that, I'll pass it along. But the Wright family was rather prominent in Washingtonville at the same time that the Moffat family was here. It wouldn't be unusual for marriages to occur within the community. So we'll do some further checking on that. And if we find anything, I'll pass it along.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, appreciate that. And
Thank you.
Yeah, and the Wrights, when Marguerite came to visit, actually, I did mention that I'm very familiar. I'm not like very, very familiar with the Wrights, but I know from my work with David Wright Hudson, he is of that line, and
Yes, right.
And his father was a dairy farmer, and they lived on Hudson Road, but the Wright family is connected to that house.
Mm-hmm.
The Wright family and the Hudson family had adjoining farms as well. The
Yeah.
two farms were connected. So
Mm-hmm.
there's quite a bit of local history intertwined among those families. So
It's all really connected together, and we appreciate
It makes
you and
sense.
your
It
wife
makes
doing
sense.
that.
I know she had brothers. Yeah, I didn't look at her genealogy before I logged on. She had a brother who lived with them. But it certainly makes a lot of sense.
okay.
Yeah. And I'd love to know that. I'd love to be able to
Yeah,
find
we'll do
out.
some further research on that because we've been quite interested in the history of Washingtonville and the history of some of the more prominent families. So if
That's
we find
wonderful.
anything definitive, I'll certainly pass it along to Matt and he can get it along to you.
I would love that. Thank you so much. It's so considerate. Thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I always enjoy about working as a librarian is that you get to be the middle person between the researcher and, you know, the other person that has the information, or you happen to have the information. You just kind of like, you make those connections. And, you know,
Mhm.
as Marguerite and I kind of mentioned with the conference and things like that, you meet people, you say, oh, maybe there might be something here, and then you never know where that's going to lead. And that's
Right.
the great thing about history and researching this stuff, you know.
Mhm.